Hi. Uh, in the last lecture, we saw briefly this painting, Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and I talked about the classicizing elements in it, the subject matter, mythological, the way that Venus is depicted is based on ancient Greco-Roman models, sculptures that Botticelli would have known, and so would his audience. Today, we start to look at the career of one of the three of the most famous artists that emerged from this period in Italy, and that is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo is truly a man before his time, and I think what shows that well is to understand that actually Botticelli and Leonardo are contemporaries and that he is significantly older than both Michelangelo and Raphael, the other two seriously famous artists that we'll be looking at in the next few lectures. Leonardo was, in fact, in the workshop, training and learning his craft with Botticelli. It was the workshop of a sculptor and painter named Verrocchio. Leonardo's background is quite different than that of most artists of his period, in that he is actually the son of a man of a certain wealth, and he was a man that was a notary, which is a sort of like member of the law profession. They notarize contracts and such. And as such, the father had the idea that Leonardo, normally a son of a notary would go on and get an education and have the same sort of background as his father and then take on the same profession. But that wasn't meant to be for Leonardo. And probably the driving force behind that is that Leonardo was, in fact, the bastard child of his father. His father had been in the little town of Vinci. I'm going to scoot ahead from this Verrocchio for a moment. Leonardo was born in this little house in Vinci, which is outside of Florence by quite a bit. It's out in the Tuscan countryside. And Leonardo's father had been kind of stationed there um, as a notary on just a sort of temporary contract. And while there, had this servant in his house, Caterina, and he impregnated Caterina. And so, because they weren't married, any issue from that relationship was therefore a bastard. And so Leonardo grew up with what was a significant stain for Renaissance society, that his parents weren't married. And what is highly unusual, though, is that Leonardo's father took in Leonardo and took him back with him to Florence when he returned there and raised Leonardo and evidently encouraged Leonardo's career, which is pretty extraordinary for this time, because normally the children would stay with the mother and Leonardo's existence would have been way different had he remained in the household of his mother. Moving to Florence meant a great deal of opportunities for Leonardo, and even as a pretty young child, he must have shown some artistic promise, and certainly he was already a very curious child, very interested in nature and natural phenomena, and just sketched all the time as we would envision him doing. And so his father put him in the workshop of one of the leading artists of Florence of that time, which was Verrocchio. So in that workshop was Botticelli, as I said, and a number of other artists that emerge from Verrocchio's workshop and go on to have important careers in their own right. From Verrocchio, Leonardo, like Botticelli and the other students in the workshop, learned the craft of drawing, learned painting, and would have been exposed to sculpture as well. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. But for now, we look at this painting by Verrocchio of the Baptism of Christ because it's here that scholars believe we see the first example of Leonardo's work. As was true in any workshop of this period, the main artist, the head of the workshop, would have been responsible for painting the most important figures in the painting, but probably wouldn't have painted the backgrounds or some of the subsidiary figures. That was just the way that it worked. Patrons understood that when they commissioned a master artist like Verrocchio, that he would probably only do the figure of Christ and the figure of John the Baptist in this case, and probably not do much of the rest of the painting. The assistants were in charge of doing those other details, and we know that Leonardo is in the shop in this moment, and we can see by looking at Leonardo's work after this point that this treatment of the landscape, that it has this kind of haziness about it, and you have this broad horizon and then this craggy sort of landscape in the background, but especially that haziness that you get in that background, that those blurred lines that are used to suggest atmospheric perspective, the way the eye understands distance and atmospheric effects sort of role in the optical perception is what is captured here in an important way, and that's certainly something we see as typical of Leonardo's style. The other thing that we see is that in this painting, and I'll zoom in on it a bit, we have a pretty standard later 15th century treatment of the religious figures. They're certainly beautiful, but somewhat linear, somewhat dry. There doesn't seem to be a lot of atmosphere, in fact, around them. And this kind of linear approach, I think you can especially see well if you compare the face, and I'll zoom back out a little bit because it gets a little granular, but you can see in the modeling of the face of this angel and even in the treatment of the hair and the coloration of the flesh is just kind of stony, sort of lifeless, especially if you compare it to the treatment of this angel's head. You've got this beautiful wave of colors, and I do have a detail of this. You have the beautiful sheen of the hair as light hits on these gorgeous locks of hair. And you've got this reflection of light here on what appear to be stone or glass beads that are on the trim of the angel's garment. Then in the treatment of the face with this rich color modeling, you see this pinkiness in the cheeks and the gradation of that color as it moves back. Even the details like the lines of the neck as the angel is turning its neck so strongly to the right. That kind of level of detail is unusual and significant here. Also, I would say the treatment of the eye. This glassy look, that kind of sparkle that you see in the eye that reflects that the eye is, of course, wet, suggests a real study of the way that the eye looks and works, and that's significant as well. What we know is that Leonardo is actually the artist responsible for this angel, and because of those characteristics that I've pointed out, that kind of his striving to achieve greater naturalism in the figure is certainly we see in his other work and is a contrast from what we see in Verrocchio's work. famously, these two angels sitting here, as this angel looks a little bit forlornly at this angel, the story goes that Verrocchio, who was responsible for painting this angel, recognized that his student Leonardo had absolutely outdone him in the art of painting, and he swore to never paint again. And you get a sense of that kind of melancholy in the face of the angel here. The other areas that I would point out, just because they're here, and I think they make a strong case for what Leonardo does and what his interests are, even from this very early age, is this treatment of the drapery. And you can really tell that Leonardo is using a model, perhaps putting drapery on a wax model, a figure, which is something that artists would occasionally do, and really looking at the way that light hits that drapery and trying to really capture the light, the areas of light and shade that are naturally created when light comes in at a certain direction. You get the cast shadow, of course, but you also get these pockets of shadow, the folds in the drapery that really give it the textural qualities of the way fabric really looks. In one of his first independent works, we see some of those same areas of interest in more of the picture, obviously, since he's doing this on his own. This was done around 1472. It's a scene of the Annunciation, that moment when the angel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary that she will bear the child of God. And Mary is taken aback by this message from the angel, and we get some sense of that as she gestures in this way, sort of taken aback. We certainly get the sense of the angel communicating this message through the angel's gesture, this sort of gesture of what looks like benediction, but is also a gesture used in Renaissance paintings as a way to show speech. So we understand what's going on here. It's all quite clear cut. The composition is intentionally simplistic, very balanced and symmetrical, so that the viewer is not distracted by things that they shouldn't be distracted by, extraneous details and such, and really focuses on this important moment of the life of Christ and obviously of the life of Mary. There are some interesting details included here that certainly pinpoint this as Leonardo's and show us that Renaissance interest in looking back at antiquity. In the lectern that Mary is using so that she can read the book, no doubt, the Bible, she it is truly a sarcophagus. It is an ancient Roman sarcophagus that she has, that she's using as a lectern, and we see these scroll patterns, this kind of garland and shell motif, totally typical of what we see of ancient Greco-Roman sarcophagi, Hellenistic and Roman in particular. And we can see that there is symbolic meaning of that inclusion, in that even in this moment when Christ first is in the womb of his mother, we're still reminded of his eventual and necessary death and the promise of resurrection that comes after that. So we see these symbolic inclusions like that to remind the viewer of the full cycle and full importance of this moment. That's echoed elsewhere in these plants that are included in the sort of tapestry that the angel sits on. You can see these various plant specimens, and they are so specifically done. It really shows Leonardo's interest in the natural landscape, and specifically the landscape that he was surrounded by. These are plant specimens that he would have seen in Florence and in the Tuscan countryside, and they too have symbolic meaning. These gatherings of three petals, three flowers, for example, relate to the idea of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And we see, whenever you see those threes in Renaissance art, that's certainly what it's recalling. But we also see lilies. Lilies are a symbol of the purity of the Virgin Mary. We see some red flowers, especially over here, that not only pick up this gorgeous red of the drapery of Gabriel, but also are meant to remind the viewer of the blood of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ. And so that ties in just like the sarcophagus in that regard. The other things that we see going on here that are typical of Leonardo, again, his interest in really showing with great specificity the kinds of plants and trees that he's including here. A cypress, for example, certainly trees that are common in the Tuscan countryside, but all of these have been identified as specific specimen and have been interpreted as having symbolic value in terms of the Virgin Mary and her various roles and in the life of Christ. Another area of the landscape where we see the inclusion of this sort of symbolism is in this port that we see and we understand is way in the distance back here. Again, Leonardo is using atmospheric perspective, so it's so hazy back here that you can just barely make out the outline of this craggy mountain back there. But we see this port. There are little ships that are in the port, and that relates to the appellative of the Virgin. She is known as the Queen of the Seas, and so again we have these inclusions that help relate back to the importance of these people, these figures that have been included here and their greater meaning. One area in particular that I love about this painting is the lap of the Virgin. And I love it so because you really see how interested Leonardo is in studying carefully the live model, understanding drapery and the way drapery moves and how that texture is, and trying to get that across to the viewer in the painted work. We see this preparatory drawing that he did for the lap of the Virgin, and it's just an extraordinary drawing and really shows how he's studying light and how it falls on the lap and makes these pockets of shadow. It's just a beautiful, beautiful drawing. One other thing that I would point out, which is just sort of an interesting aside, is that we see the Virgin wearing red, yellow, it's kind of a goldish yellow, and blue, the primary colors. It'd be fascinating to see if there are other Virgins that are painted this way. I have to say none immediately come to mind. Certainly that she would have on red and blue is not unusual, but the inclusion of that yellow I think is striking. And it makes me think of a painting by another Renaissance artist, but, well, he's really more in the Baroque period, that's working in Northern Europe, Vermeer, who does another figure at another moment with red, yellow, and blue. And that's been understood as relating to the profession of painting. And I wonder maybe if the same thing is going on here. It would be an interesting paper topic for someone. Leonardo gets another major independent commission, and this is for an altarpiece for a church, the Church of San Donato. And here, it's a very odd looking painting, and there's a good reason for it. It's odd because he didn't finish it. He got started on it, made some headway, and then abandoned the project. And in fact, he abandoned not only the project, but Florence and leaves for Milan, and we'll look at that. Here, Leonardo, precisely because it is unfinished, we can see the areas and his sort of process in developing his paintings. And obviously, he sketches out everything quite thoroughly before he actually begins the application of paint. And he would have done many preliminary studies on paper before he had gotten to this point. But we can see that he's already figured out the perspective. We have elements in this painting that we see recalled in other commissions. He's very much interested in the movement of horses, and you can see that with this rearing horse back here. You have another one over here. You've got a horse here and here. And he's captivated by the kind of energy and power that the horse displays. And we'll certainly talk about other examples of Leonardo's horses. What we also see is that he's completed, or so it appears, the leaves of this tree and this little tree in the background. It's the first thing he finished on this particular painting, and we may take it as a sign of how he would approach his other paintings, doing the landscape elements first. But he's also worked out the composition, obviously, and he's made a very stable composition. There's still a real sense of symmetry here. And all, there's this kind of framing that happens. You get this circular area that frames the Virgin and Child, obviously the central focus in the composition. This is an adoration of the Magi, the three kings that came to visit Christ soon after he was born. And we see one of the kings kneeling here and offering one of the gifts that was brought to the Christ child. But other than that, what we see is a real study of different kinds of faces and facial expressions. We have Joseph here, who is shown in this gesture as he holds his forehead. It's a gesture that symbolizes epiphany, and he is truly in this moment recognizing that this son born by Mary is in fact the Son of God. And then, so we see that Leonardo has thought about how to show this moment of the Epiphany in the face of Joseph, this kind of introspective but also kind of surprised and yet knowing face that is on Joseph. But you see these other facial expressions as well. And Leonardo truly was interested in the variety of the way humans looked and the different kinds of facial expressions that could be used to communicate emotion. So Leonardo abandons Florence. Oh, I should say before I get into that, sorry, that this, his contemporary, once again, Botticelli, had painted just a few years prior to Leonardo the same subject matter of the Adoration of the Magi. This is a very popular subject matter in Florence. And you can see that it is perfectly symmetrical. You have these two groupings on each side, and then you could slice the thing right down the middle. You've got the Virgin and Child in the midpoint of the composition this way and this way, right? And you've got the king who's offering the gift up. You've got Joseph back here in this same moment of epiphany, a little less dramatic. He practically looks like he's sleeping, and in fact, he is often shown sleeping in that scene. I could make a wisecrack about fathers in the early stages of childhood, but I'll try to refrain. But we do see the king here is kneeling, and these two are, some of these faces are really individualized, and in fact, we know who some of these people are. They were Botticelli's contemporaries. They are members of the Medici family, and we have an inclusion of the artist as well. So he's certainly individualizing the figures, but I hope you can see that the sense of light in Botticelli's work is much more uniform. And because of that, it always has this kind of linear and cold feeling about it, which we don't see in Leonardo's work, as he's really moving away from that, and trying to make things warmer, but also to look the way that we see them in real light and in real lighting conditions and atmospheric conditions. Another work before Leonardo departs from Florence is this one, the so-called Benoit Madonna. And I show it to you because it makes such a striking contrast with a Virgin and Mary that we'll see by Michelangelo, and shows us a typical subject matter of Florentine artists. This was really the bread and butter for Florentine artists, making these devotional paintings that would be put in people's houses. And this was a very popular subject matter. And Leonardo's approach to it is really innovative. Instead of a rather static, unfeeling looking Virgin and Child, we really have what appears at first glance to be just any mother and child as they're interacting very naturally. You can see that the Virgin looks down lovingly at her child. The baby behaves like a baby, is one healthy baby. And he is looking in curiosity at this little flower that he holds, and studying it with great interest. And of course, this flower is also a flower that is symbolic, um, and relates to that kind of sense of purity and chastity, those virtues associated with the Virgin and, of course, with Christ as well. But it's a lovely painting, a really beautiful depiction of motherhood. And we think that these kinds of paintings were meant to serve as models to the female viewer who would gaze upon them in her private domestic setting and try to emulate the Virgin Mary in her own role as a mother. Leonardo's drawings, which I'm just going to kind of flip through. You saw me go through this one quite quickly, but this is, just shows you how interested he is in those different facial types. And obviously, this is an older man. He's studying those wrinkles and what we can read of the character of the person by looking at their facial features. And Leonardo is consistently interested in that. He does a lot of plant studies. We've seen already how his plant studies show up in his work. And he does other sorts of studies that are pretty interesting, like this one from 1479, a drawing that he did of a prisoner, that Bernardo Baroncelli, who was hung outside of the prison of Florence as a really public display of the punishments exacted on these members of this family and this family's allies. It was the Pazzi family and their allies who had tried to kill the leading members of the Medici family, Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano, in the famous Pazzi conspiracy that happened in 1479. And they were partially successful, these members of the Pazzi family, in killing. They killed Giuliano de' Medici. Lorenzo was able to escape. And Lorenzo made sure that the Pazzi family and their co-conspirators were drastically hunted down and punished for having risen up, and for having killed his brother, obviously. And so this is one of the men that was hung. And it's a fascinating study on Leonardo's part because he's totally uninterested in who this guy was or why he's being hung, but is really studying the way that the human body hangs, and the facial expression and all of that. And, Leonardo, though we see a lot of emotion in his paintings, is pretty disinterested, as far as we can tell, in actual human interaction, and describes men as sacks for food. He's really always kind of harsh in the way that he describes his fellow human beings, which is strange, considering it's such a contrast from what we see in his work. Some more studies, this one of an embryo, and we can see that, this dates from around 1510. I know some of these dates are cut off, for that I apologize. But we can see that he's interested in dissection. We know that he did a great deal of dissections in one of the hospitals in Florence. And he studies everything, every part of the anatomy. He's fascinated by how the human body is put together and how it works. And here, obviously, he is studying a womb that he has cut open, and inside studying the child that was within. And we see him studying here the female body, and you can really see how scientific he is in his study of the body. And I think he's interested in it for a number of reasons, but we certainly see him incorporating the lessons that he learns from these scientific studies into the way that he depicts his figures, and includes plant life so accurately, and includes atmospheric perspective. It's because of these scientific studies that he does. But Leonardo was also interested in inventions, as I imagine you are aware. And he here is studying and thinking of how to do different kinds of war machines. And it's around this time, here we have, for example, this multi-barreled cannon and a machine gun, and he approaches the Duke of Milan in this moment, one of the Sforza dukes, Ludovico il Moro, Ludovico the Dark One, and in fact, the Dark One because we think he was biracial, which is a kind of a fascinating thing in this period. But anyway, he approaches the Duke of Milan and offers his services as a military engineer, and writes to him saying, I can build you new fortresses and new kinds of war machines and help protect your city. And by the way, I'm a good painter. That's exactly how he puts it. And evidently, the Sforza Duke is quite interested and invites Leonardo to come up. And Leonardo does reshape and rebuild the fortresses of the city of Milan. He redesigns a canal system for Milan, and does important city improvements in the defense of the city. But while he's there, he does also paint. And this is one of the paintings that dates from this first trip of Leonardo's to Milan. It's from 1483, the Madonna of the Rocks. There are two versions of this painting, one in the Louvre and one in the National Gallery in London. And there's some confusion about why there are two versions of this painting, but we're just going to focus on this one. This is the version in the National Gallery, and it shows the Virgin with the Christ child here, St. John the Baptist, and an angel. And what we have here is a really primordial setting, this rocky landscape that looks like a landscape we would expect to see, dinosaurs roaming around in. And what it really is meant to communicate to the viewer is that this is kind of a space on Earth before time itself, or at the very origins of time. And the reason why he's made this setting, or at least as far as we can understand, is that this is meant to relate to this idea of the purity of the Virgin, specifically the idea of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin. And the Immaculate Conception refers to the immaculacy of the Virgin, not of Christ or of her mother. It's about the immaculacy of the Virgin, that she's free from sin. And there was a debate about whether the Virgin became pure in the womb of her mother, or whether she was pure the moment that, you know, God selected her, or if she was immaculate from the very beginning of time itself. And here, obviously, we're seeing the take on it that she's pure from the time, or the beginning of time itself, represented in this landscape. The inclusion of the figures here, we can see it's this really soft light, and the outlines in Leonardo's work are getting kind of smokier and smokier. The darkness and the smokiness in his work is something that is characteristic of Leonardo's style. The smokiness we call sfumato, S-F-U-M-A-T-O, sfumato, which means smokiness. The darkness, that kind of dramatic use of dark color and dark spaces in his work, is called tenebrism, T-E-N-E-B-R-I-S-M. While he's in Milan, he is given the project of an equestrian monument, which he was to make in honor of the Sforza family in general, and of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. And what we have here is something that, as I had already mentioned, is an important an important component of Leonardo's work, which is the inclusion of horses. He's fascinated by them. And here is his perfect project to think about them even more. Equestrian monuments are another form that we see in the ancient Roman period, and a kind of monument that is really meant to honor the heroism or the intelligence of the ruler that it honors, or the war hero that it honors. And in this case, Leonardo was trying to be as inventive as possible. He wanted to make a horse that was shown rearing back on its hind legs, so all of the weight on the hind legs. Here you've got the rider, of course. The horse has its head turned towards the left, towards the viewer in this case, and then has its forelegs upraised. But there are all kinds of problems with doing this, and most importantly is the question of weight and stability. And so already you can tell Leonardo's a little worried about it, and so he draws a captive underneath here that would have acted as a means of support for the forelegs and the whole, front half of this monument. This was meant to be in bronze, and what is truly extraordinary about it is how big it was supposed to be. The horse alone was supposed to be 52 feet in height. It was gigantic, absolutely colossal, which again is another way that Renaissance artists are trying to outdo their ancient predecessors. These are some of the examples that Leonardo would have known. There's this very famous ancient Roman imperial monument, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, and certainly Leonardo would have known of other examples. There were examples in and around Milan that he would have known that have not come down to us. The problem with bronze equestrian monuments, or any bronze sculptures, is that they're often melted down and reused because the material of bronze is so expensive. So it's very unusual for us to have any that come down to us, especially from the ancient Roman period. But here we have the very famous one of Marcus Aurelius. You can see that in the precedent, you have the horse standing pretty firmly on three legs and one hoof is upraised. And the ancient Roman artist that made this made the figure of Marcus Aurelius quite large in proportion to the horse. There's always this issue of how to manage the proportional relationship between the horse and rider without having the horse sort of overtake the importance of the rider who is being memorialized. So that's the way the ancient Roman artists dealt with it in the case of the Marcus Aurelius monument. This one is one certainly Leonardo would have known. It was done by his teacher, Verrocchio, and it is in Venice. It is the equestrian monument of Bartolomeo Colleoni. It sits outside of the church of, or the Scuola of San Marco in Venice, and we'll actually study that building and its environs when we talk about Venice. What we see here is how closely Verrocchio studies and mimics that ancient precedent in the stance of the horse. It's a very powerful looking horse, and I think that that's an important component of this work. And, he's really studied the way the horse turns its head and the musculature of the horse. It's quite an impressive animal. We have the rider above, and you can see that the proportional relationship is different here. The rider is significantly smaller compared to the horse, which is, of course, more like how you would see it in real life. The equestrian monument that Leonardo was supposed to do was never completed. And in fact, the only thing that was done was the clay model for the horse. And that's as far as he got before the French invaded Milan and ousted the Duke and took over the, the site where Leonardo had been working on this horse near the foundry in Milan, and it was used in the end as target practice. The clay model of the horse was used as target practice, and that, needless to say, eventually caused its complete demise. The woman you see here is the mistress of the Duke of Milan, of Ludovico Sforza. Her name is Cecilia Gallerani. There's been some debate about her identity, but I think most art historians agree that that's who we're looking at here. It's a portrait of a beautiful woman, as you can see. She's dressed not very fancily, and in fact, Cecilia came from a common household. She was not of noble blood, but she was renowned for her beauty. And certainly, I think Leonardo has allowed us to see that beauty, has recorded it for posterity. She holds this rather strange looking animal. It is a weasel. And that relates, we think, to her name. Um, and oops, sorry, and some superstition about weasels believed at the time. But anyway, that it's a sort of what can I say? A sort of language association between the weasel and Gallerani, Gallus in particular. And so that's sort of the basis of why we think that that's who we're seeing is Cecilia Gallerani. What we see in terms of Leonardo's style and his treatment of this figure is certainly innovative in that for the most part, portraits of women up to this point had been strictly profile portraits, and I'll show you some examples of that shortly, perhaps in the next screencast, however. But what we see is that so innovative, the inclusion of her hands. Often women were shown cut off about here, truncated to just show the upper torso. And we see her turning around. So we have a 3/4 view here. She's not in strict profile. So these are innovative aspects. While we still have the artist showing us a woman, that's not looking directly out at the viewer, and so maintains those ideas about chastity and modesty for Renaissance women, that they weren't supposed to look at anyone directly. That was crossing these behavior comportment lines that were not meant to be crossed by women of the period. We'll see how he manages that differently in another example. One thing that may look striking to you is this black background. And I would say to ignore it, because we know that this black background is the result of a 19th century collector who wanted to have that background black, and wrote in this upper corner that this is by Leonardo. So it's not original to Leonardo. The most recent restoration of this painting suggests that the background would have just been a kind of grayish blue, but we don't know much beyond that. Women usually were shown inside of identifiable domestic contexts, like a wall behind them or whatever. But certainly we know that Leonardo in other examples shows women in landscapes, but that doesn't seem to be the case in this painting of Cecilia. While in Milan and before the invasion of the French, Leonardo is given the commission to do what surely is one of two of his very most famous works, one that I'm sure you recognize. It is The Last Supper. This painting was done for the refectory, which is the dining hall, of the monastery connected to the Church of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. This subject matter for the dining hall is totally standard. The scene is of the last meal that Christ had with his disciples. And it was absolutely the norm for this to be the subject matter in the dining hall of a monastery or convent. It was meant for those dining in the room to look at and contemplate the significance of this meal. And there are multiple important ideas around this meal as it is related to the institution of the sacrament of communion, because it's here where Christ says, that the bread is representative of his body and the wine of his blood, and shares in this first communion, an important institution in the church. But there are other levels of meaning here, but I think that's pretty central. But the other thing that we see here is that Christ seems to have just announced that, in fact, one of his disciples will betray him. And he said it He's looking down. He has both hands open and extended, one gesturing towards bread and one towards the wine. And you can see in these groupings of three that these apostles are reacting to this news. And it's with Leonardo that we get a true sense of reaction. And that's one of the most innovative and remarkable things about Leonardo's approach to this very standard subject matter. The way that he's grouped them in threes, it gives you that sense of a sort of dialogue among these three in each group as they're talking about, like, oh my God, is he talking about me? Am I going to be the one to betray him? Or gesturing out, and it's, using gesture to really communicate to the viewer what they're saying. Like, can see that he's talking and like saying, what did he just say? And you've got these figures reacting in shock and horror at these words, and understanding, for one thing, that this will, this is the end of Christ's life on earth, and how horrible their beloved teacher is going to die, and that one of them will actually be responsible for it happening. The only person that doesn't really seem to be reacting quite as strongly is this guy. And this, in fact, is Judas. And Judas is pulling back a little bit. You get a real diagonal line here as he's pulling back. And, he's hurt and doesn't seem very shocked by the news. And in fact, Judas is already holding in his hand the bag of silver that he was paid by the Romans to identify which one is Christ when they come to arrest him. Judas is reaching out towards a piece of bread and getting ready to dip it, and Christ knows and states that the one that does that is the one that in fact will betray him. So we've got this sense of a real moment in time that is caught here. And the kind of human reaction and expression and conversation is what Leonardo so effectively communicates to us here. And it just had not been done before in this subject matter. It's extraordinary. Something else that he does that's remarkable is not include halos. Instead, the divinity of Christ in particular is made clear through using light in a different way. Specifically, 3 windows have been cut out of the back of this wall, and the light frames the head of Christ. So like a halo, but using things that we actually see in real life, as Leonardo, of course, with all of his study, was more interested in doing than showing halos that you don't see in real life. He's used perspective to really draw the viewer in, and you can see the lines of the perspectival grid really clearly drawn out, both in the rafters of the ceiling up here and in these panels that are on the wall. These panels have been a source of mystery, and they are either tapestries, I think that's likely what they are, or they're openings of some sort. But I think tapestries is more likely, because often tapestries would be on the walls to give the room more warmth usually, but also for the decorative, for decoration in the rooms, in the Renaissance context at least. So that seems to be what's going on there. But they also help lead the eye back to this central point, which is behind the head of Christ. So everything leads us back to the most important figure in the scene, of course. This is perhaps a better image to show you what the coloring is like. It's very hard to get a good photograph of this painting, and it's such a problem, this painting. And I suppose that's one of the reasons as well that it's so famous. But Leonardo here tried to use a new fresco technique, and specifically, he tried mixing in oil with the tempera that was usually used in fresco painting. He wanted to be able to delay how quickly tempera dries and bonds with the wall. And so mixing in oil, he thought, would do that, and that way he could make changes as needed and, you know, do different sort of lighting effects if he was able to incorporate oil into it as well. It was, unfortunately, a complete failure. Oops. A failure because the oil, unfortunately, made it so that the pigment did not adhere to the wall. It did not bond with the wall in the way that it should in fresco. And so it started to peel off the wall pretty much immediately, and it's still peeling. There have been numerous restorations of this wall painting, and people, we change our minds about what the best approach is to restoration, whether things should be repainted or not, as the science of chemistry evolves. It has an enormous impact on conservation. New techniques are invented based on those discoveries in chemistry that help us clean the work without destroying it, and so forth. But you know, it's been handled so many times that it's really just in deplorable condition, and in fact, it's highly doubtful that it will last a whole lot longer, this image. So it's truly kind of a sad story, but in large part, really because of how Leonardo painted it. His desire to experiment in this case was not for the best. Anyway, I think I, in fact, wanted to show you, this is the scaffolding up from the last round of restoration that took about 20 years to do from start to finish, or so it felt like. But anyway, it was a long, long restoration campaign. And they think that it's fairly stabilized now, and think that they've gotten things back to the original hand of Leonardo, but as usual, there's a great deal of controversy about what's original, what they've repainted, and how much damage it does to expose this original paint, and whether that will just hasten the flaking up off of the wall. So anyway, it's not a solved thing by any means. Just to show you an example that is perhaps more traditional in its approach to this subject matter, just so you can fully appreciate what Leonardo does differently. This is by Ghirlandaio. It's from about 1480. Ghirlandaio, another contemporary of Leonardo's, and a painter that is important to us, especially. He was a beautiful painter in his own right, but also, as we'll learn about, he was Michelangelo's teacher. What we see Ghirlandaio do here that is traditional is the placement of Judas on the other side of the table. Judas has always been shown this way to fully demarcate him, so he's just not part of the fold anymore. And Leonardo obviously chose not to do that, not to approach it that way, which certainly enlivens the composition and kind of makes you contemplate and look more closely to see where Judas is and understand how and why he's reacting to Christ's words, which is different than what we see in Ghirlandaio's. Here, the faces are individualized, and there's some gesturing that's taking place. In some earlier examples, you wouldn't have even had that. They would have been seated frontally, no connection really to each other, and just meant to sort of represent what was going on without showing it in sort of more naturalistic terms. I'm sure you know this painting. This is, of course, the Mona Lisa. Mona is sort of an American shorthand form, for whatever reason, of the word Madonna. And the Italians use a shorthand for Madonna, which is Monna with two N's in it, which I guess is where the American one came from. But the Italians tend not to call her Mona Lisa, they call her La Gioconda, because this is Lisa Gioconda, the wife of a Florentine merchant of some success, evidently, who commissioned a painting of Lisa. Either she commissioned it for herself or her husband commissioned it. We don't really know. In fact, we don't know a whole lot about this painting, which is just one of the enigmatic parts of it. But what we do know is that Leonardo, probably just saw this as yet another portrait of a woman that he needed to do. So many of these were made in the Renaissance because husbands wanted to kind of show off their property, which the woman was considered, or there were other motives for making these portraits of women, and I'll show you some earlier examples in a second. But what we know is that Leonardo began this painting, we think, around 1503. And while we have these dates here, 1503 to 1506, the reality is he kept working on this painting for the rest of his life. He never gave it to whoever his patron was, but took it with him as he moved around, as he left Florence for Milan and then Rome, and then for the court of France. He had it with him the whole time. He had it with him when he died, and it is in France, at the Louvre, where he would have wanted it to be, I imagine, despite the attempts and complaints of the Italians who would like to have it in Italy. So that is, who she is, but that's only part of the question, because what we see Leonardo doing, I mean, we don't know why he kept held on to it for so long, but we also don't know why he showed her this way, because it's so strikingly different from other portraits of women of the period. I'll show you some examples. So here is another painting by Ghirlandaio of Giovanna Tornabuoni. And this is a typical, especially 15th century representation of a married woman. We understand that this woman is quite young. She's just gotten married. She's shown strictly in profile. She does not look at the viewer in any way, acknowledge us at all. She's fancily dressed. She has her hair all done up, and she has on the jewels that she received as part of her marriage, and she's beautifully dressed in these gorgeous fabrics that certainly were expensive and show off her social status. In the background, we see a rosary hanging and a little book and another jewel and an inscription that records who she is. And the painting in general is a real celebration of the virtues of Giovanna Tornabuoni, these ideal virtues of any woman: chastity, morality, modesty, piety, certainly. And truly, her husband wants this record of the ideal qualities of his wife. And it's kind of less about her in that sense than that his pride in being able to have her as his wife, and she's absolutely shown here as something to be consumed, obviously, by her husband. These types of paintings would have been in the domestic context. They would not have been seen by a large public by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing I should point out is that we see her firmly enclosed in this domestic setting. We see this wall, this niche, and there's no space on either side. We saw already Leonardo's early approach, which I told you was different in that we see the figure turning away from the profile, and while we don't see her looking at the viewer, she certainly seems more lifelike, more vivacious than this very cold, stone-like figure that we see in Ghirlandaio's painting. Another work by Leonardo prior to the Mona Lisa, another portrait, is this one of Ginevra da Benci, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And here, she's still kind of lifeless. She's just so white and pale, and doesn't seem to be, in movement or reacting, though I will say she is looking out at the viewer. So that's innovative. And behind her is this big bush, and this is a juniper bush, which relates to her name, Ginevra. Okay? And then she's in a landscape setting, so no longer enclosed within the domestic context as the Tornabuoni portrait and as probably the Cecilia Gallerani portrait were. In the Mona Lisa, Leonardo really uses that new approach to a really softer flesh, and this kind of haziness of the background, the blurry lines around the figure. It's just this softness that permeates the whole composition. And Leonardo is using oil paint, and that's an incredibly important thing. We already saw that he was interested in oils, but it didn't always go well, as the disaster of the Last Supper. But in this case, in a panel painting, he really explores the possibilities that oil paint allows. And oil paint had just started to be imported into Italy in the probably mid 1470s, but didn't make its way down to Florence until a little later than that, more like in the 1480s. And it's coming from Northern Europe. But Leonardo is one of the first to really explore the possibilities. You get sort of more subtle color gradations with oil. You can achieve different sort of light effects with oil. And because, it does have this kind of inherent softer line, you can make changes to it easily, which you can't with tempera paint. And it just really freed up the possibilities for the artist. And you can see Leonardo really exploring that here in the Mona Lisa. Both of her hands are included. She's seated what appears to be quite naturally out in this landscape. There's a kind of wall that separates her from the landscape. But when we get to the level of the shoulders and in the head, it's so blurred, this delineation between what's part of the woman and what's part of the landscape, that art historians have talked about this connection between woman and nature and what that may mean for Leonardo and his world. And especially in Renaissance writings of the period about women, they certainly discuss this connection, and they relate it to the fertility of the woman and the woman being able to produce children, and relating that to the earth and all of that stuff, as you can well imagine. But what's so different here, I think, really striking here, is that the Mona Lisa, I mean, this woman is not at, you know, not youthful really anymore. She does not look like a woman that has just been married. Her hair is down and relaxed, not at all the way we are accustomed to seeing women portrayed in this period. She has on really simple clothes and they're very dark colored, so it's obviously not about showing the status of her and her husband with these rich clothing. She has no jewelry on. It's just really different from the way we see women represented in this period. Some have suggested, in fact, that Lisa is being shown here as a matron, years after she's been married. Perhaps she's already had children. Perhaps she's a widow and is wearing dark clothing because of that. But we really just don't have enough information about her. Strangely enough, they have exhumed her body and are doing forensic tests to see if the bone structure it corresponds with the bone structure of the face that we see in Leonardo's work. Who knows? Anyway, I'm going to put this link to this video in the course materials so that you can watch this very brief video about humanism and the start of the Renaissance. I'll have some other links to videos as well. I think that'll do it for this lecture, though, and we'll pick up with this in the next one.